It's Good Friday, or at least it will be at the time this is recorded and uploaded on Reach Radio. So, with that said, and saving Good Friday for some more Easter themed questions, because we always want to put more emphasis on the resurrection when we can.
Yeah.
The crucifixion of Jesus is a controversial topic, just not only, among Muslims, but also among atheist and liberal historians. So when it comes to the fundamentals of Christianity, the gospel by which we're saved, we start in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 3, where it notes, "This is the gospel by which you're saved, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he rose again the third day," is also in there. But those first two are a part of that same sentence.
Right.
So these are things that we would also believe. Why do we believe this historically? And this will be the first question I'll bring up. How do we know that Jesus died by crucifixion? The apparent death theory that maybe he swooned on the cross, maybe a surrogate took his place like Thomas or Judas. Maybe Surah 4, 157 is right, and that Allah did such a good job tricking everybody that he created Christianity by accident. When it comes to the historical claim of Jesus' crucifixion, what is the actual evidence? What does evidence actually mean? And why would it be a more reasonable conclusion to say Jesus did die by crucifixion than not?
Okay, well, as far as his cause of death is concerned, I guess to bottom line it, according to very well-documented records that we have from the procedures that were implemented in Rome as far as their justice system is concerned, if someone was crucified, they were crucified to make an example of them. We were talking a bit last night in our study in the book of Esther about how the Medo-Persians were the ones who invented crucifixion. Initially, what they would do would be they would take a person who was guilty of a capital crime, take a long, sharp stick, shove it up from between their legs till the point was sticking out of their collarbone, and make them an example. The problem with that procedure was that people died way too quickly, and so they wanted to make an example of that. So human beings, being the fallen, sinful, yet ingenious critters that we are, came up with the whole idea of crucifixion, which is probably the most shameful death. I believe it was the Roman orator Cicero who referred to it as that. It was also an excruciating death, in the sense that it even changed the language. The term excruciating literally comes the term ex crucis, or from the cross. There was no more painful way to be able to die. However, those who were crucified would often last on the cross, sometimes up to 3 or 4 days before they'd finally expire. There's, again, an article in the Journal of the American Medical Association tells us that when people died from crucifixion, there were some who would die from shock. There would be some that would die from blood loss. But the vast majority would die from suffocation, believe it or not. Because when you're crucified, and those of you who are watching online can see me demonstrate this, your arms are held upwards above you, putting pressure on your rib cage. That means that in that position, you can inhale, but in order to exhale, one has to pull up in order for your diaphragm to be able to force the carbon dioxide out of your lungs. So as long as you are able to have the strength to be able to do that and continue to empty your lungs of carbon dioxide, you would continue to live while you're on the cross. So when Jesus was on the cross, he was on the cross for 6 hours. Because it was the eve of the Passover, the request was made that the legs of those on the crosses would be broken to facilitate death. Once you couldn't push up with your legs, you would not be able to arch your back enough to be able to eliminate the carbon dioxide. It'd also be incredibly painful to push against your broken legs.
Which is kind of superficial at that point. But it's important to note as well that according to the historical, medical, and literal research provided by William D. Edwards, and you can look this up, on the physical death of Jesus.
Right.
he not only described everything that you're talking about, but the historians note, and this can be found in Tacitus, Josephus, we have archaeological records of crucifixion victims still with the nail in their heel bones.
Yeah, you can see that in the Israeli Museum of Natural History, this heel bone with a Roman nail stuck through it.
And pagan sources like Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars and so forth, all of these things were centered around crucifixion, not just being limited to being nailed to a cross, but a three-step process. First, they would put you through what, and if you've seen The Passion of the Christ, you saw a censored version of this, the half-death, or the flogging.
Right.
The flogging involved, and this is going to be graphic, but you need to understand this in order to appreciate Jesus did in fact die on the cross. That's what we're talking about here. First, being subjected to the machinations of a lector, which was a trained Roman torturer, and a cat of nine tails, which involved 9 leather strands with intermittent animal teeth or glass shards and metal dumbbells in between them. The reason they were designed this way was so that they would, in equal parts with every strike, tear and bruise flesh at the same time, which is why after a certain number of strikes, we have records of Romans.
The 40 lashes minus 1.
Yeah, because most people didn't survive 40 lashes. We have records of people dying just from the first stage of Roman crucifixion.
And not to, again, to be graphic about all of this, but if the lector did his job, you would first be bent over a post so that your back would be flexed. This would facilitate the lacerations of the flesh. And if the lector did his job, oftentimes internal organs like the kidneys would be exposed.
Right, and that's important to note because the blood loss would be traumatic, and that was meant to weaken you when you were put on the cross. But it wasn't just limited to the torture of the whipping, because after being subjected to the 40 lashes minus 1, and sometimes they would do more just to prove a point, when they would then hand you off to the Roman garrison, it was up to whatever their twisted minds could come up with in order to make you a public example. We know from the eyewitness accounts, Jesus had a purple robe placed on him, tore it off, and then had a crown of thorns hammered into his head with a scepter. Now,
he was also blindfolded.
Yes.
And they called out to him, prophesy to us, tell us who hit you.
And that wasn't...
On the trip that you make in Israel up the Via Dolorosa, the Way of Sorrows, in East Jerusalem. One of the sites that you can see are the excavated remains of a place where they would play this game they called Hot Hand. And they would put a prisoner in the middle of this thing. It looked kind of like an old 4-square court you would see on a playground. And they would blindfold the prisoner, turn them around so they'd be dizzy. And if the prisoner happened to stumble into the square that was occupied by one of the Roman guards, they would be able to rear back and smack them in the face, which would not allow an individual to brace or be able to anticipate the blow.
And that's called being blindsided, which is when real injuries happen. If you know professional sports getting punched, they learn to lean into or away from the punch, not into them. When that happened, they, of course, hot hand involved the whole Roman garrison, which was at minimum 200 soldiers. And note as well, that wasn't the first time Jesus had been beaten that night. When he was put in front of the Sanhedrin, and in particular Ananias and Caiaphas, they also subjected him to beatings in between their trials. So on top of the Romans, he had also been beaten and abused by his fellow Hebrews.
Right.
Now note that point, and this is in particular because we want this to sink in. When those activities were being done, when Jesus was being subjected to a wide variety of different tortures at the hands of these guys, that was still only stage 1. Then, in order to conclude this final stage, as the records note, you would be forced to carry the crossbeam, which was about 145 pounds.
Yeah, called a patibulum.
Yeah. And they would parade you around the city in a 1-mile march and portray basically your crime as a warning to the rest of the city, saying, this will happen to you if you do this. And Pilate, to the chagrin of his detractors, wrote down Jesus' crime, that he was the king of the Jews.
Yeah.
So that was the point.
In 3 languages, so no one missed the point.
Yeah. So first stage, the whipping, hot hand, the imagination of the Roman garrison, the march in this blood loss state, which is why Jesus was to the point of exhaustion that he couldn't carry the cross to his tibia anymore. He had to have Simon of Cyrene carry it for him. That is what would ultimately bring him to stage 2, which involved, and you can read this again in William D. Edwards on the physical death of Jesus, having a nail, a 9-inch nail, pierced through your wrist. Now, the text says arm, but in the ancient world, anything above the elbow counted as your hand. So when we see modern art put it through the hand, that actually wouldn't support the weight of your body. And we have archaeological evidence to prove that. When they would...
They put it underneath your palm in a place called where the navicular bones are in the wrist. So there'd be enough ligaments and bone structure to be able to support the weight of a person on the cross.
As well as the median nerve, which would be the equivalent of ramming a stake through your funny bone.
Yeah.
So it would not only destroy your hands, but you would literally be hanging by your exposed nerve endings with metal pierced into that.
The hand pretty much is stuck in almost a clawed position. It doesn't work any longer.
And understand why as well. People who are pulling against this not only have a non-existent back with potential organs showing across a rugged piece of wood, but on top of that are pulling against their nerve endings in order to fight for their breath. So the Romans did their homework as far as how to make someone hurt. When they stopped moving, that meant that they weren't breathing, but that was still only stage 2. Stage 3 would begin when they would confirm the death under no less than 2 Roman witnesses. Four.
Yeah, and this is described, by the way, in John chapter 19 and verse 31. It says, "Therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the bodies should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken and they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and the other who was crucified with him. When they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out."
And there's something poetic to that because, again, in William D. Edwards' paper, he notes that if someone's heart had ruptured, it was no longer circulating the blood throughout his body. If it was allowed to settle, the blood and the serum, the cells actually, and the serum, the fluid, would actually separate. So when it says the blood and then the water flowed, or vice versa, that was talking about the fact that Jesus' death by autopsy would have been his heart rupturing.
Yeah, there's a lining around the human heart called the pericardium that does have fluid in it. And if a person has a severe myocardial infarction, it's called, this lining around the heart will fill with watery fluid. And so there are those who believe that when this Roman soldier gashed Jesus' side with the Roman pike, which was a 6-foot-long spear with a metal tip on the end, the sight of blood and water flowing from the wound could mean one of two things. Either Jesus' heart was pierced at that time and had literally exploded in his chest under the strain that he was under, or the fact that blood and water flowed from a wound. One of the dead giveaways that someone is dead is that the serum and the solids in the blood separate. So if, like, say, you cut your finger and blood and red stuff and water flowed from it, you're in extremely bad shape. In fact, you've been dead for quite some time.
Yeah, it means your heart hasn't been pumping for at least an hour.
Right.
So when it comes to what killed God, it was a broken heart.
Yeah.
Let that sink in.
Yeah.
But with that point then being made, this was the third stage, the death blow. And there are other records. People would have their heads smashed in. They'd take them off and let wild animals rip them apart. They would verify their death in some way. And that was done with the Roman pike. They, of course, say it belonged to the Roman soldier Longinus, and they have a bunch of relics in it. We don't know what his name was. But the point being made is this. When Jesus had his death verified publicly, documented in all 4 synoptic gospels and the gospel of, or 3 synoptic gospels and the gospel of John, all 4 gospel accounts, it is beyond any historical, archaeological, medical, or biblical doubt as to whether or not Jesus died by crucifixion, because a full Roman crucifixion has never and could not ever be survived. Now, the point of emphasis is once again that. You say, well, there had to have been somebody who survived crucifixion. When you're saying crucifixion, you mean all three stages. No one's surviving the death blow, let alone everything that led up to that
Yeah,
point.
Josephus had a friend that he spotted being crucified and asked the Romans to take him down as a favor. They took the friend down who had just entered into the process.
Of
but
stage two.
Yeah, but he had died. He died within 2 days from the wounds.
And that's important to note because he wasn't fully crucified.
Right.
He was only partially crucified because a Roman crucifixion would involve all three stages.
Right.
So note that point when we say Jesus was crucified, but he didn't die. How ridiculous that would sound to anyone who actually knew what they were talking about. That's why even atheists, in Lawrence Strauss, in his critique of Christianity, he said the apparent death theory, again, no kind words to say about Christianity, but he said it was absolutely ridiculous. There is no way to justify that.
Yeah, and there are those seemingly intelligent people with a lot of initials after their name that I've heard, well, maybe Jesus survived the crucifixion. They put him into the tomb. Then the cool air in the tomb or the spices he was anointed with revived him. He managed to get out of the tomb. He was seen by his disciples afterwards, and they thought it was a resurrection. Can we think of some fundamental problems with the swoon theory?
Well, once again, you have to pretend the death blow didn't happen. That's a historical claim that goes against multiple pieces of evidence that we have. You have to provide a better source, not an assumption, than what's actually written. Secondly, when you note the apparent death theory or the swoon theory, you also have to be ignorant of everything that's come before the death, the death blow, the first two stages, and someone left in that state, like Josephus's friend, would, of course, pass from their wounds. You have to provide a demonstrable reason for that to have happened. And the Quran saying, well, it supernaturally happened because you can't write better Arabic poetry doesn't convince us. The point being made is this. When we're talking about the swoon theory, the apparent death theory, it banks on someone knowing nothing about what a crucifixion actually was.
Yeah, or even the historical data from Matthew chapter 27 and verse 62, where we're told, on the next day, which followed the day of preparation, the chief priests and Pharisees gathered together with Pilate, saying, Sir, we remember when he was still alive how that deceiver said, after 3 days I will rise. Therefore command that the tomb be made secure until the third day, lest his disciples come by night and steal him away, and say to their people he's risen from the dead, so the last deception will be worse than the first. Pilate said to them, You have a guard, go your way, make it as secure as you know how. So they went and made the tomb secure, sealing the stone and setting the guard. Now there were two things that caused this stone to be, in a sense, tamper-proof. First of all, it was sealed. A Roman seal would carry Pilate's Roman insignia upon it. They basically would, if they were going to seal something, take a piece of wax, and in the case of the rock on the tomb, they would have a couple of cords with wax on either side of the rock, would be joined together with a large amount of wax in the middle part of it. Then the Roman official would come and stamp Caesar's seal into the wax in the middle of the rock, the stone over the tomb. The punishment for violating a Caesar-sealed object of any kind, including this stone, was crucifixion upside down. In other words, you did not do this. Allowing someone to violate a Roman seal, if you were a Roman soldier, would result in punishments like being burned to death, or having the rest of the members of your troop beat you to death in a very merciless manner. So these was a very great way of securing something. Notice we are told that there was a guard that was placed there. A Roman guard is anywhere from 4 to 12 Roman soldiers who are extremely skilled at being able to defend a particular piece of real estate up against an entire platoon and hold it in many cases. So you have this highly trained Roman guard, you have Caesar's seal on the tomb, you have a stone rolled in front of the tomb that weighs, and we've seen some of these stones on our trip to Israel, some of these stones that would cover other tombs. The stone itself would weigh anywhere from 800 pounds to 2 tons. So what the swoon theory wants me to believe is that this Jesus, who has undergone everything we've already described here, right, is placed inside this tomb, somehow survives crucifixion, somehow survives having a Roman soldier jab his side and blood and water flow from the wound.
First person in history to do so.
Somehow he survives this. He comes to in the tomb, is able to, squat thrust out of the way an 800-pound to 2,000-pound stone after going through all of that, then overcome an incredibly motivated Roman guard, make his way to his disciples after having suffered all these things. And by the way, we are told that Jesus was so savaged before he even got to the cross, you could barely recognize who he was as a human being anymore. The prophet Isaiah prophesied that his appearance was marred more than in any man, and his form more than the sons of men. So this individual, who's probably looking more like Hamburger Helper than a human being, makes his way to the disciples, says, I've risen from the dead, and they go, oh boy, let's go and tell the world about this. You believe that, you've got more faith than I do.
Yeah, you've made a bigger miracle than the crucifixion and made more bold claims than Jesus' resurrection, historically.
Right.
So that's the point. If someone's going to claim, well, they only thought Jesus died, it banks on ignorance of the crucifixion and the actual data that we have on both Jesus' experience with it and what it was. So understand that point. Now, another follow-up that I think is warranted, and we'll be brief about this because we have another individual who's sparring, I should say, for an interesting conversation. But this is another important issue that we all as Christians should be able to understand. When it notes that the apostles said this, how do we know that they just didn't make it all up? How do we demonstrate historically that the apostles were reliable sources on Jesus' crucifixion, let alone his resurrection?
Well, first of all, what constitutes a reliable historical witness?
That I emotionally respond to everything you say positively, he said sarcastically.
No.
Now, there's 4 ways that people look at historical criticism rationally. The first is hostile testimony. If you have someone who has to admit to fundamental details about something, it's more likely to be true. If you have enemy sources reporting the same basic details, of which we have the Talmud Sanhedrin reporting Jesus' death, not by crucifixion. It notes that he was hung, but it's important to note that. There are the reports of Josephus and Tacitus, who are non-Christian sources. Josephus, albeit a bit more positive, but Tacitus reports in his Annals of Roman History that Christus was crucified in Judea under the praefect Pontius Pilate. Josephus goes on to note the significance of people and how they responded to it. There was another report in noting the apostles admitting their Messiah was crucified, but even more importantly, there was also Saul of Tarsus, who preached Christ crucified in his letters to the churches. When he was an enemy, he converted on the basis of seeing him alive after that death, which again, we're not arguing the resurrection yet. He admits to the crucifixion, which was humiliating.
Yeah, Pliny the Younger, the Roman governor, also had some pretty blunt things to say about what Christians were all about.
But he did acknowledge that their founder was crucified. And
Right.
there was even debates mocking Christians, showing their God crucified.
Right.
So that's an important point. Hostile testimony. There's also embarrassing testimony, which I mentioned briefly, things that you have to admit to, like an enemy testimony. If you have to acknowledge facts that wouldn't have helped your case, like, for example, your God being subjected to how the Romans showed they were the new boss in town, that was not something you would propagate unless it was something that you had to admit to. The fact that they acknowledged it is something that historians look at and say, that's probably an admission, not a myth. And also note as well, when we're talking about accounts of embarrassment, the resurrection has that too. We'll get to that on Friday. But it's also important to note they're looking for not just hostile, not just embarrassing, but multiple testimonies. If you have multiple groups saying the basic fundamental things, they don't have to say the same thing, but the same key event, like I mentioned with the Talmud. Did Jesus die? Yes. Tacitus? Yes. Josephus? Yes. The
Pliny
Gospels?
the Younger, yeah.
Yes. So they're looking for multiple sources that say the same basic detail, and Jesus' death is affirmed by not 1, not 2, not 4, but many, dozens of historical sources, which is the 4th key one, that are not only embarrassing, not only hostile, not only multiple attestant, but primary sources. The closer you are to the main event, the better. They don't expect that of anything in history. Otherwise, we know nothing about anything older than 1,000 years. It's just the way things are. But when we look at the gospel accounts, we look at sources like Josephus Pliny. Our copies of them certainly are post-dated. But we need to understand this. The information and the individuals who are reporting it are living during the lifetimes of people who saw it with their own two eyes. That's what the word history means, histor, eyewitness. Someone saw something take place. So when we're looking at the gospel accounts and note embarrassing testimony, do the apostles match that criteria? Yes. In fact, they went on, and this is important, to continue to preach this until their own deaths, with one exception. That was the Apostle John, who didn't have it easy. We'll get to that more in a second. Do we have multiple testimonies? Yes, all of the apostles and enemies of the gospel, not including two, but certainly not limited to either, Saul of Tarsus, who also affirmed the apostles' message when he saw Jesus for himself. We'll get to that more tomorrow. And, of course, do we have these sources admitting to details that were embarrassing? Your God being crucified being one of them. So do they match a historical muster? Absolutely. But once again, they could have just gotten lucky, because the guy who put these standards together was Napoleon Bonaparte. When archaeology started to really kick off, they had rules for what they'd take seriously and what they wouldn't. So maybe the apostles got lucky, and their myth, their story, something they knew was a lie, was something that would match a standard that post-dated them over 1,500 years. So maybe I can put that theory forward. But here's the problem. I'm attributing to the apostles malice and motive. I'm saying that they knew this was a lie and then went on with this religious movement that apparently just got more popular, and no one saw that coming. What's the biggest stone in the shoe to that position?
Well, the big question is this: why die for a lie?
For your lie.
And understand something. The disciples, when we talk about them, as you mentioned, 10 out of the 11, not counting Judas Iscariot, died brutal, grisly deaths, right? And all they had to do to prevent those deaths was to simply say, we made it up. We just thought that this would be a great philosophy, or this makes us feel good. I remember in the book of Acts chapter 4, when Peter and John are brought before the same seasoned group of political power brokers who railroaded Jesus into crucifixion, they were told never to speak or teach again in the name of Jesus. And their response is pretty instructive. They looked at this group and they said, whether it is right in the eyes of God to obey you rather than God, you be the judge, but we cannot but speak the things we felt and earnestly wished were true. No, the things we've seen and heard. So the disciples were willing to die at that point. They were willing to follow Jesus down that path of crucifixion, but not for something that they felt or earnestly believed or had other people. They were willing to die for first-hand eyewitness testimony that Jesus had risen from the dead.
And this is what's so important, because people say, well, maybe they just wanted to martyr themselves in order to start a religious movement. The Middle East heat, I guess, inspires some weird passions. Understand that for people to die for a lie, and this is why I specified that, they have to believe it's true. No one dies for something they knew they made up. You can attribute insanity, but once again, that's not fitting the kind of lives these guys went on to make.
And it also flies in the face about what we know about their previous character.
Because
when Jesus was crucified, did the disciples say, oh boy, we got to stand for our Savior here?
If it was made up, I'm sure they would have said that they did. But guess what? There's another account of embarrassment. Every one of them to a man abandoned him.
Except John.
Yeah. So here's the point. When we're working with the actual historical data, atheists, liberals, they don't mind referencing the Bible. But when it comes to what's actually there, they will take it as a source of information. And if it's only the Bible, or rather only one of the Gospels in the Bible, they seem to forget that the Gospel accounts are 4 sources, but we'll let Bill Maher be Bill Maher. The whole emphasis and crux, pun intended, of Jesus' crucifixion being historically reliable stands in the testimony of men who otherwise would have been the first men in all of human history to die collectively for something they made up, or possibly something that they were simply reporting was true, and their lives showed it. The data showed it. Their enemies' responses showed it.
Yeah, the radical change in the life of the disciples, going from cowards who disowned Jesus, Simon Peter denying that he even knew him 3 times, one time to a little servant girl, right?
Yeah, when she challenged him on it. And Peter
suddenly willing to die for what they had seen and heard. Something extraordinary had to happen.
Yeah, and maybe you follow guys like the Muslim Cowboy or Sneeko and say, well, the Council of Nicaea made up all of the apostles' reports and stuff. Maybe the apostles never existed. I'd encourage you on your own time, look up Sean McDowell, Dr. Sean McDowell, who wrote his doctorate on the historical validity of the death of Simon Peter, James Bar Joseph, and the other apostles. Now, Peter and James are his 2 sources, and those are the ones that he drives home to the bone. The rest, we have enough to come up with the idea, but it wouldn't be something we'd hold up to court the same way we would the crucifixion.
Right.
That's just the fact of secondary details. It's not written in the Bible. But when it comes to the death of Simon Peter, the primary eyewitness of the resurrection and crucifixion by extension, and James ben Yosef, which we'll talk about more tomorrow when we get into the he rose acrostic. He's a very juicy source of embarrassing testimony because he was Jesus' half biological brother, the physical offspring of Mary and Joseph. You have an older brother. You didn't give me that honor. When it comes to what it would take to prove to you that your older brother, I won't mention his name on air, but he knows, that he was God, to verify his claims, what would it take?
A lot.
A resurrection from the dead would be a start.
Yeah.
So James, he thought his brother was insane, and we'll get chapter and verse on that again tomorrow when we have more time. But the point of emphasis was what? That these men all went to their deaths. The primary witnesses went to their deaths. Not one of them recanted for mortal consequences. Now, we compare that to modern events, like, say, for example, the Watergate scandal, and you have less than 5 people who were only risking political embarrassment and maybe a fine, and they couldn't keep their mouths shut for 2 weeks. Now we have men who went the rest of their lives claiming something they saw firsthand, and we're going to assume that they were lying because we don't like the conclusions that leads us to. We're not being objective with the evidence if we're doing that. So when it comes to the Roman crucifixion of Jesus, that is as historically certain as anything ever can be. And you know who I'm quoting with that? Atheists. Dominic Crossan, Bart Ehrman, Pincus Lepee, James D.Z. Dunn, all people who are so far on the left end of the spectrum, not just away from Christianity, but politically. They wouldn't believe that their mother loved them if it was written down. And yet what? They all acknowledge that if anything can be certain historically, the crucifixion is it, which is not only a big nail in the coffin of Islam, because it denies this historically, but also a key detail in the third point of 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 3, that Jesus rose from the dead. He had to have died in order to rise. That's why it's important to be able to prove this. Now, if you say, well, Jesus never existed, hey, guess what? If his death's documented, he had to have been born at some point. Just saying.
Yeah.
So that's the point that we'll leave with that. We got about 30 seconds, so we won't get into...
And, just to kind of wrap it up, it was coming face to face with these facts that really was what God used to rock my world and begin the transformation of me from someone who didn't believe in God at all to someone who received Jesus as my Savior. My football coach read the Journal of the American Medical Association article, William D. Edwards, and I had never heard these sort of things. My view of Jesus was the skinny Northern European guy on a nicely polished piece of wood, couple drops of blood coming down, but to find out exactly how Jesus suffered, it raised a question in my mind. If I don't know this about Jesus, what else don't I know? And if you are in that same boat, let me encourage you, look for God's truth, ask him to lead you into truth. You're going to discover that Jesus lives and that he wants to have a relationship with you.